From developments on the provincial labour front to Alberta leadership for the federal government's efforts to expedite major infrastructure projects. Time now for tonight's politics panel. And joining us this evening, Rob Breakenridge, a broadcaster, columnist and host of the Line Alberta podcast, and Jim Groom, political scientist, recently retired from Medicine Hat College. Good evening to you both. And let's begin with a strike being averted by thousands of provincial workers.
This collective agreement is unique in its size and complexity and extremely challenging to negotiate. But after 18 or 20 months, we put it in the hands of our members to vote on.
Yeah, and the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees says just over 63% of its voting members have supported a mediator's recommended deal. The new collective agreement includes a 12% wage increase over 4 years, weekend shift premiums, recognition as well of all provincial and federal holidays. The AUPE has about 23,000 members in sectors including law enforcement, social services, natural resources, and administration. Rob, what's your read on what it took to get a deal done here?
Well, it took a lot, as you heard in the clip. I mean, this was a pretty elaborate deal, and it's a pretty large deal, like a massive deal when you look at how many employees this covers. So it is interesting with all of these, some of the labor uncertainty on other fronts in Alberta, which I imagine maybe we'll touch on, that they were able to deal with this one. And this was a big one, to have that kind of labor unrest hanging over, tens of thousands of public servants. That's potentially a huge challenge for the government. Moving forward, though, and I think we're seeing this federally where governments are looking at ways to cut costs. And there was a parliamentary budget officer report suggesting that maybe the public service in Ottawa could be trimmed back. And some hint or suggestion that maybe that's something the Carney government is looking at. So with Alberta now facing a larger deficit and some real pressure on the budget with a growing population, softening oil prices, even though we have this deal in place, is this something that maybe the Alberta government's going to circle back to in future budgets here over the next couple of years and maybe look at making some cuts in departments or cuts to the civil service? And even though we have this deal now, could we still see some labor unrest in the future? That's going to be one to watch for. But yeah, this is pretty big right now, I think.
Jim, how surprised are you that a strike has been averted, given how hot this labor dispute was back in the spring when 90% of AUPE members voted in favor of strike action?
Well, it certainly is important to avoid that strike action. I don't think it works well for either side. And the fact that this is such a complex deal, and the government must be pretty happy that they've been able to maintain the 12% over 4 years, even though they include a lot of retention, money for retention, training, and facilitating that way, as well as things like shift differential and other advantages that they'll get. But I think in the long run, this is it's going to serve both sides fairly well. Although, as Rob points out, it's a very complex deal, gets into great amount of details on great specifics. But at some level, this has been a win for both sides.
Rob, you mentioned the federal government and the talk of austerity on that side. So in getting a deal done, what kind of a position do you feel this contract with the AUPE leaves the Smith government heading into session in late October?
Well, I do think it puts some pressure on them, to deal with the teachers that, okay, if you can get a deal done with public sector workers, given how tense things have been, what's the challenge then in getting a deal done with teachers? So that's another big one that looms large right now. With school back in, the idea that teachers could strike or be locked out. So that's something they are going to have to deal with. But yes, I mean, the budgetary pressures, look, the Alberta government's facing now they say $6.5 billion deficit. That's up from the budget. And by the time we get to the next quarterly update, that could be even larger. And that's despite the fact we're still dealing with almost $17 billion in resource revenues. And that's still much higher than previous Alberta governments have had to deal with. So, if we're in a situation where we need $20 billion in energy revenues just to get close to a balanced budget, we've got some real pressures. And look, this government is pretty clearly averse to looking at the revenue side. So, yeah, if we see some cost cutting in the future, that could reopen a lot of these irritants between the Alberta government and government workers.
Maybe on that point, Jim, how big of a disruption would it have been had AUPE members not ratified this collective agreement and gone on strike?
Yeah, I think you're right, Michael. That it will be a challenge. The collective agreement is a stumbling block, and one of the concerns, of course, is monetary. But until they can resolve that, that becomes quite the issue.
All right, elsewhere on the labor front, and Rob brought this up a moment ago, the Teachers Association, ATA, saying today no talks with the province have been scheduled, though it is willing to return to the table if there is movement on salary. The Finance Minister, Nate Horner, meanwhile, today calling on the ATA to get back to the bargaining table and get a deal done. Jim, surprised to see little in the way of movement here. You know, there's signals of apparent willingness to return to the table, but nothing for either side to warrant biting on.
I am sorry, Michael. I'm not hearing you very well here. I'm disconnected with this. I'm afraid.
No worries.
Can I get you to repeat that?
How about this, Rob? I think you caught that.
Right. In terms of getting a deal done with the teachers here, I mean, this was pretty huge, as I alluded to, right? I mean, but there are bigger challenges going on right now in Alberta schools in terms of just how quickly our population is growing, a lot of schools bursting at the seams. So there is a lot for the Alberta government to navigate through all of this. And there seems to be some disagreement here between how many teachers we have in Alberta and how much those teachers are paid. And so that's where there seems to be some gaps between the Alberta government and the Alberta Teachers Association. And there's some risk here, I think, for both sides, right? And something this high profile that's going to impact so many families. If it's the Alberta government that locks teachers out, do they take a lot of the blame for the disruption? Conversely, if the ATA walks off the job, do teachers catch some of the blame? But there is tension. I mean, this whole book ban controversy that just illustrates where even beyond the numbers, there's some real tension and differences between the Alberta government and educators on how to administer education in Alberta.
Rob, how much of a distraction is the book ban dialogue on this issue of negotiations for the teachers?
Well, you look at just what a huge controversy this became over the last week or so, and international headlines, the BBC and New York Times and elsewhere. So it hasn't made Alberta look good, and I think it does illustrate where there is a real tension, and you see it in other respects where the Alberta government's sort of dictating how things should go in schools, believing that they have the support of parents, like when it comes to names or pronouns or these sorts of issues. So clearly there's a level of distrust, I guess, or the perception that maybe the Alberta government's trying to portray teachers as not being on the sides of students and families, and they need the Alberta government to intervene. So you got these political issues that are creating a lot of tension, I think, here, and that's spilling over, I would imagine, to the negotiating side.
All right, time for us to take a bit of a break, but when we come back, the significance of Calgary landing the federal government's major projects office. More from our panel in a moment. Welcome back. We heard from the Calgary Chamber of Commerce off the top this evening on Calgary being named to headquarter the federal government's major projects office and the appointment of notable industry executive Don Farrell to lead that effort. Rob, what's your takeaway on the Carney Liberals tapping Calgary for the location of this office? What's your read on the significance?
Well, it's certainly been warmly received here. I mean, to hear the Premier praising the decision, praising Don Farrell. It's good to see that, Ottawa and Alberta are kind of on the same page here when it comes to having Calgary as the headquarters for this office. I guess where there does seem to be some trepidation still is what comes next. And if this is just kind of throwing Alberta a bone by saying, fine, we'll put the office there, but some of these project decisions are maybe going to go in a different direction, then all of this could be for naught. That if Alberta's frustrated at the decisions the government's making, it might not really matter all that much, I guess, where this office is or who's in charge of it. But it certainly signals some alignment between Alberta and Ottawa when it comes to prioritizing energy as part of major projects. Now, look, that may end up being more so on the LNG side than on the oil side, and I don't know if that's going to lead to some tension down the road. But I think for now, it it bodes well, especially when it comes to federal-provincial relations, at least in this area.
Jim, lots of plaudits for Dawn Farrell and her track record in the energy sector. What's your read on the significance of her appointment?
Well, I think it's a very positive appointment. Once again, it's starting to show that there is some symmetry between the two levels of government, perhaps as well, and that maybe things will be smoothed out somewhat as the time goes forward. And I think that's a positive advance for everyone involved.
Rob, you talked about what hinges on the outcome and government alignment. What kind of political dynamics then do you see Dawn Farrell having to navigate in serving out her role in leading this office?
Well, look, I mean, she's a pretty serious person, and I think, or I hope that, this isn't going to be too affected by politics. But yeah, that's going to depend on a lot of things, and most notably in terms of how the federal government chooses to approach these issues. But they've got a straight shooter in Dawn Farrell. They got somebody who really understands these issues as it pertains to Alberta's energy needs, Canada's energy needs, where there's some opportunities to really bolster Canada's economic independence, to really be a powerhouse when it comes to energy. Like I say, I think there's a lot of opportunities when it comes to LNG, especially some projects in BC that have a lot of First Nations involvement and some real opportunities for partnerships there. I think the bigger challenge is the East Coast. And, we had both the Prime Minister and the Energy Minister talk about LNG exports to Europe. That's a little more challenging, especially when it comes to natural gas that's developed in the West, which is where the bulk of Canada's natural gas comes from. So there's going to be some issues to sort out there. But the idea that this is a priority, that when we talk about projects that are of the national interest, it includes energy projects, that's a big win for Alberta. Now, obviously, there's some policy disagreements elsewhere, and those aren't going to go away. But I know this is certainly a positive step in easing some of those tensions and trying to get a win-win.
And Jim, the PMO has indicated the first set of project announcements will be made in the coming weeks. What do you see hinging on those announcements, especially with Parliament set to resume shortly?
Yeah, well, I think Poilievre's going to start to take the main role here, of course, in his line of criticism. I can't imagine that we're going to see instantaneous results right off the bat. Of course, we need someone to buy into this, not just from the government perspective, but also willing to advance quite a significant amount of funding in order for this to take fruition. And that funding, in the current environment with tariffs and everything else involved, it's not going to be forthcoming fairly early. So it may be frustrating to all levels of government that they're not able to get things activated quite as early as they'd like to. And that's going to give fodder for the opposition. And of course, that can be a problem in Parliament when we get a lot of separation and the opposition plays the role that they're supposed to play, then it can be a little contentious.
All right. Speaking of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre is calling on the federal government to scrap the temporary foreign workers program.
In most cases, I don't think they do need temporary foreign workers. I think they hire them because they can pay them less. Pierre
Poilievre is proposing the program be phased out, leaving only an exception for agricultural workers. Last year, the Liberal government introduced new rules to reduce businesses relying on temporary workers. Jim, why lean so hard into this issue of immigration? What purpose might it serve Pierre Poilievre?
I think there's a couple of facets to it. The first aspect being that during the last election, there was a strategic change for the Conservatives that they decided to embrace labor movement, workers, replacing what in some cases was the NDP traditional function. But they made a conscious choice that they were going to take that position. Now, unfortunately, when this occurs, it also alienates the small business owners in the world, in the country, and that can be problematic as well. So Poilievre has to take a kind of a delicate approach here, and he doesn't seem to be taking that easier approach. He seems to be taking a bit of a machete rather than a scalpel to the issue, and I think that might come back to haunt him at some point. The other aspect is, and I hope he's not appeasing those anti-immigrant groups within the Conservative movement. We see this in his last before the last election, where there was some appeasement of people that had rather negative views of immigration. And that can be a bit of a dangerous route to follow as well.
Rob, last word to you on this. Canadian Federation of Independent Business CEO Dan Kelly telling the media the suggestion of permanently scrapping this program is, in his word, ridiculous. What degree of risk comes with this policy approach for the Conservatives?
Yeah, it's some strange bedfellows here. So yeah, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business criticizing the Conservatives. Today, the Alberta Federation of Labour came out and applauded this decision, you know, still saying, well, we disagree with Pierre Poilievre on most other stuff, but we like this idea. So it is interesting to see. And the Conservatives are leaning into that kind of economic populism, appealing to blue-collar workers. You saw some element of that during the Air Canada dispute, where they came to the defense of flight attendants. And it was weird to hear, like, the Prime Minister's talking about how, the concerns of businesses need to be listened to, and Pierre Poilievre saying, oh, you're just trying to defend multinational corporations. It sort of upends kind of right-left politics as we've known it. It also speaks to a real absence politically on the federal scene of the NDP. So, but look, I mean, there's high levels of unemployment among young people in this country. There's still concern about home ownership. And the Conservatives, I think, are smart to say, hey, we're going to address these issues, and it's linked to liberal mismanagement on the immigration side.
Indeed. All right, gentlemen, we're out of time. We'll have to leave it there. Great to see you both. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Rob.